What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Pioneer video. And today we're going to be taking a look at the Rakdos Vampires deck and kind of giving you a beginner's guide and ins and outs of how to play the deck, kind of what you're looking for, what you want to see, and everything like that to do with the Rakdos Vampires deck to get you ready for the RCQ season and get you qualified for RCDC, which honestly is like a really cool name for a regional championship if you think about it. When you just shorthand it, I think that's really cool. Before, of course, we get too deep into the Rakdos Vampires list, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more content like this, you want to see other modern videos and longer form videos, please consider subscribing to the channel and ring the notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. And just recently, we crossed the 500 subscriber threshold, so now we're actually able to have members on the channel. I have a few different tiers I set up. They're super basic at the current moment, but looking to add more things kind of as we go on and as there's kind of like a demand for things. So if you want to see any of that stuff, please, consider joining, becoming a member today. If not, subscribing and of course ringing the notification bell is plenty of support there as well. So that out of the way, let's go ahead, check out this Rakdos Vampires deck. And the important thing to know, at least kind of like a little history lesson of Pioneer, if you will. There was a time really before the Mirza Karlov Manor Pro Tour where I think Rakdos mid-range was the de facto Rakdos deck. There's people playing Rakdos Sack, but it just really didn't seem to be, doing it for the format. And even a time before that, there was actually a real consideration between those two. But, kind of going into this, remember that like Rakdos mid-range was kind of the deck that people expected to perform very well at the Pro Tour and really did not perform that well. However, there was two Rakdos Vampires players that made the top 8 and two very notable players that ended up making the top 8 of this event with a deck that was kind of like laughed at and kind of memed on, before, leading up to the tournament after we kind of had like the deck list published and everything like that. And I guess even in kind of like that playtesting circle as well. And this deck ended up proving to be the real deal. It ended up winning the Pro Tour, and ever since then, it has been one of the most played decks in the Pioneer format. And honestly, living up to kind of the hype and everything, where people, again, were kind of making fun of it, won the Pro Tour. Maybe it was just the deck of the tournament. Who knows if it'll actually be good. Turns out it is very good, and you can kind of derive some of the strategies and things that you're going to look for kind of from the Rakdos midrange deck that'll translate a little bit more to the Rakdos Vampires deck than you might expect. So here with the Rakdos Vampires, the kind of thing that we're looking for, there's a super powerful synergy that goes into the deck, and that is Sorin Imperious Bloodlord plus Vein Ripper. Now, I know a lot of people know Sorin Imperious Bloodlord because for a while there was like Duskmantle Champion or whatever it was. It was like a 5-mana 4/4 vampire you put into play that you ended up drawing a bunch of cards in like these in these Vampires Tribals deck. All right. And then, we had Galta Mavrin in one of the, Phyrexian sets. That was going to be kind of like the thing that broke Sorin, because you could potentially play this on turn 2, have Mavrin, Galta in play on turn 2, and then turn 3, just make a giant dinosaur and kill your opponent if they didn't have a way to get rid of it. Obviously, that was not very good, because Sorin Imperious Bloodlord saw absolutely no play, and somehow Galta and Mavrin saw even less than that. But with this card called Vein Ripper, it actually made Sorin Imperious Bloodlord very powerful and had some nice synergies, obviously, with Vein Ripper as a whole, and with the way the rest of the deck could be constructed based on some of the other cards that we actually had printed previously before Mirza Karlov Manor, and of course, Vein Ripper being printed in that set. So Sorin is kind of like the linchpin of the deck. I would say it's a pretty important card. Obviously you have like this high rolly kind of, you can have Sorin Imperious Bloodlord playing on turn 3, put a Vein Ripper into play. That's obviously the most ideal thing to do. You're like mana, even if you play a Preacher of the Schism, which could be okay, but if you're putting in Dusk Legion Zealot or like Blood Tithe Harvester, you're not really getting anything from it. You're actually down, mana, because you spent 3 mana on the Sorin to put in a 2 mana card. Is not very good. However, Sorin's other 2 abilities can be very, they can be very good. So, target creature you control gains a Death Touch and Lifelink until end of turn. If it's a vampire, it gets a +1/+1 counter on it. And the other one is you may sacrifice a vampire. When you do, Sorin Imperious Bloodlord deals 3 damage to any target, and you gain 3 life. So with a +1, you can sack a creature, and you get a Lightning Helix effect. This can give you a little bit of reach in some of the board stalls. Maybe you can trade in your Dust Legion Zealot to trade with their Blood Tithe Harvester, or eventually stack up enough damage to actually kill like a Preacher of the Schism, or even another Vein Ripper potentially. Vein Ripper is going to be a little bit more dangerous because he requires you to sacrifice a creature to pay its ward cost, and while this deck does have some creatures it can kind of throw away, some of the other decks have a little bit harder of a time dealing with Vein Ripper, and that's what kind of makes it so good, which we'll kind of get to here in a minute. Sorin also, in a way, like helps Vein Ripper become unkillable. At 6/5, it's, your opponent can discard, have a Lightning Axe, discard a Phoenix, whatever, and then sacrifice a Ledger Shredder, and then they can end up getting rid of the Vein Ripper. With Sorin's +1 to put a +1/+1 counter on a vampire, and to give the creature lifelink and death touch, that's going to get Vein Ripper crucially out of that 5 toughness range and into 6 toughness, which is going to require multiple spells and then multiple creatures to actually get rid of the Vein Ripper, which of course getting you more triggers of Vein Ripper. So you're going to be able to kind of race a little bit in like those situations where if you just put a counter on it and it goes unimpeded, you're going to gain 7 life from that attack, 8 from the next attack, and then if your opponent's having to block, they're going to end up losing life, and you're going to end up gaining life as well. It's just going to make it super hard for your opponents to try to outrace you in situations where you have kind of like this combo on turn 3 and they're not able to deal with like the Sorin. So while that combo is very powerful, and we kind of went over some of the situations where Vein Ripper is very powerful, of course, in the Amalia matchups are a little bit tougher because they can just gain a ton of life and then they nuke the board, and it's like, sure, you drain me for 20, but I'm still at like 85 life and you have no board. It's totally fine, and there's obviously a lethal threat in play that you then have to worry about, and there's potentially another lethal bomb on top of the library that you really have no way of actually getting rid of. So while that combo is very powerful, one of the other best decks in the format, or what I think, is in the top 3, is going to be very good against like the Phoenix decks, where they're going to have a little bit harder of a time, and then the Amalia decks aren't going to have very much targeted removal, if any, for something like a Vein Ripper, but you do have to worry about them just comboing and killing you if you're tapping out on turn 3 to put a Vein Ripper into play. Now, we talked about that being very powerful. It's one of the main reasons to play this deck, because a 6/5 flyer that is basically a super blood artist on a stick for all of your other creatures, for all creatures, is pretty powerful. But the rest of the deck is very good. So you have like the disruptive elements of kind of like the traditional Rakdos midrange deck, where you have 4 Thoughtseize, where you get to probably the best discard spell ever printed. Probably the best like single card discard spell ever printed. You can talk to me about like Cabal Therapy, but like Thoughtseize is probably like the best one, and there's a reason why it's like played as a 4 of in just about every format that it's legal in across multiple decks. Best discard spell ever printed. We have 1 Duress. There were some lists that were playing 2. Traditionally speaking, in like these mid-range decks, I kind of like playing somewhere between like 5 and 6 discard spells. I think 7 to 8 is kind of pushing it. Although if you wanted to kind of like push it in this deck a little bit more and maybe like trim on a land or 2, like you could possibly do it, because it's a little bit better with this card, Fable the Mirrorbreaker, being legal. This is a card that has been good in a lot of formats. It was banned in Standard. Surprisingly, not a card that seems to even be considered to be on the chopping block for for Pioneer, excuse me. And I think while it is legal, it is going to be one of the best cards that you could possibly play in the format. So makes it 2/2 when it enters, 3 mana 2/2, and when it attacks, you create a treasure token. Awesome. It's going to help you generate some mana so you can eventually hard cast Vein Rippers if it actually comes to that. The second chapter, you can discard up to 2 cards if you do draw that many cards. And that's kind of where mid-range decks can kind of falter, because if you draw, Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, Duress, Bitter Triumph against like the control deck, there's not really many targets for something like Fatal Push. So you have Fable the Mirrorbreaker, to discard those cards and potentially draw new cards. Start flooding out, you just pitch those lands, and then you have a better chance of drawing actual spells. You need lands. You can, it plays a role in everything where, it does a very good job of like finding lands if you need lands, or at least giving you a good chance of finding lands, a good chance of finding threats, and just getting rid of cards that you don't need. While, like something like Croxa used to kind of benefit from this like very well, and that was kind of like what helped the Rakdos decks end up like closing out games pretty quickly. When you have something like a Vein Ripper and you have a little bit better of a combo, sticks around, punishes your opponent for not answering it, kind of like punishes them pretty good too when they do, we don't really see that kind of like synergy anymore. But even still, Fable, great card. And then the backside, creating a token that's a copy of another non-legendary creature you control. It gains haste, and then you exile it at the end of turn, or at the beginning of the next end step. So then you have Vein Ripper is not a legendary creature. So, if you kind of have like your Fable combo where you have 2 flipped Fables, you're able to make a ton of Reflection of Kiki Jiki tokens. To then untap, make a ton of Vein Rippers, even getting to make a ton of like Preacher of the Schisms, even like Dusk Legion Zealots as well. Like those are just going to let you draw cards, Blood Tithe Harvester to get blood tokens. You have some pretty good creatures that you want to copy with just 1 Fable the Mirror Breaker. Imagine having 6 on the battlefield and you're going to have 6 Vein Rippers. If your opponent somehow manages to, not take the damage, like they block all of them, they're going to be losing a ton of life, because you're going to have 7 Vein Rippers and they're going to lose 14 life, and you're going to gain 14 life for each creature that ends up dying in combat, which is going to be pretty tough to do with a bunch of 6/5 flyers coming at your opponent's face, where if the attack doesn't kill them, the triggers certainly will. So that's kind of like what we're looking at here for like this mid-range deck, and I think it's pretty easy in this deck in particular to have kind of more of an aggressive draw, and I think you kind of need that in the way of, the early turns. You're looking to kind of like Thoughtseize your opponent on 1, take kind of like their starter piece, like Phoenix, you're kind of looking to take some of their like draw power, while they got like Ops and, things like that. I wouldn't necessarily take those cards. But, you can just disrupt them by kind of taking the removal spell. If they're leaning on something like a Ledger Shredder, you can end up taking like their Ledger Shredder, one of their early creatures, one of their enablers, if you will, to kind of like disrupt them long enough to where, if they go till turn 4 or turn 5 before they get back a Phoenix or 2, and you're already able to put a Vein Ripper into play, or get like a Shielder down, Preacher of the Schism, what have you. Any one of these 3 cards, you're going to be in a very good position versus, just not having any sort of disruption, or kind of taking the wrong piece and kind of like misevaluating exactly what's going on. While this deck can play a longer game, it doesn't necessarily need to play that longer game. So if you just have that quick disruption, you have Thoughtseize Duress on turn 1, figure out what your opponent has going on, and then from there, having like Blood Tithe Harvester or like Dusk Legion Zealot, or find 2 mana spells to leave up. Dusk Legion Zealot is going to replace itself while also giving a little bit of extra value with Sorin, because you're going to be able to throw it at your opponent if you need be, or you can start getting pressure early and start gaining a little bit of life to make kind of like the Phoenix matchup a little bit harder of a race. And technically, it could allow you to live an extra turn against the Amalia decks to kind of find an answer for an Amalia, or find an answer to whatever they searched up to, potentially kill you with, if they're not able to kill you with like the Amalia. So, that could potentially come up. Turn 3, you slam a Preacher, and you're just going to be able to attack and either make 1/1 vampires with lifelink, or you're going to be able to end up drawing extra cards. You're going to end up losing life as well. But, having those extra cards in hand, being able to build up to like a Fable and Mirror Breaker, Sorin into Vein Ripper is going to be super crucial in just ensuring your survivability, as well as just getting to absolutely slam the door on your opponent. Going further, we have this mana base where you have Cliffs, Blights the Pathway. You have 4 Blood Crypt in the deck. You have 3 Sulphur Springs as like your dual lanes of choice, and then you have 2 Cavern of Souls, which a lot of the time, of course, is going to name Vampire. There is the potential that you could just name Phyrexian with this, so you can actually cast Shielder of the Apocalypse, which we all know this card is very powerful. Has 0 Vampire synergies, but it is so good in this deck that you just want it to have it, because again, it is such a powerful card. It's just going to sit on the battlefield. Your opponent's going to lose life. You're going to gain life for drawing cards. Obviously, it's going to synergize pretty well Fable the Mirror Breaker, while punishing their own Fable the Mirror Breaker as well. Against like the Phoenix decks, you're going to end up having to they're going to get punished for casting their cantrip spells, which they want to do. They want to be able to cast Treasure Cruise. They want to cast Op. They want their Considers, they want Sleight of Hand, or I guess Sleight of Hand doesn't get hit by it, but you know what I mean. Like a lot of their really good 1-mana spells are going to draw them cards, or draw them a lot of cards, and Shielder is going to just absolutely punish that. You have like Hive of the Eye Tyrant, which is like another like mana sink kind of like threat. Notably, this deck does not look like it is playing the red one. It's not Hive of the Eye Tyrant. They're not playing the Den of the Bugbear. I'm assuming just kind of opting for, the 3/3 as Menace, and whenever it attacks, you can exile a card from a player's graveyard, so it's like a way that you can kind of get in on some of those board stalls against like Phoenix and end up putting pressure on them while also eating key pieces of their graveyard to kind of stop them from being able to get out of the situation they're in. Mutavault, you can pay 1 and it becomes a 2/2 creature with all creature types until end of turn. So this is like a way that you can get some sneaky damage in where you can kind of like tap the Mutavault for a colorless mana, activate it with the mana it produced, and then use Sorin to like fling it at like a creature to ensure that something like your Preacher of the Schism, your Shieldred gets through, maybe your Vein Ripper ends up getting a trigger and you end up gaining a ton of life. Again, even like throwing at your opponent's face. I mean, if you use a Mutavault and throw it at like your opponent's creature and kill it, you're going to drain them for 4 and you're going to gain 4, and then you're going to be able to get in a ton of damage with Vein Ripper on top of that as well, through attacks and through just triggers alone. You have 3 Swamp, you have a Takenuma, so you can end up picking up any one of these threats, plus a Sorin Imperious Bloodlord. And on the sideboard, I think you kind of want to focus on, taking... Obviously, the sideboard is used to help fix your bad matchups. Well, I think Rakdos midrange has some theoretical bad matchups. Like, I still think some of the other, like, go big, like the Niv Delight decks, just go a lot bigger than what Rakdos midrange is able to do. I just think Rakdos midrange can do it a lot faster than they can. So I think they end up getting the nod a little bit in, like, in those matchups that they have, Sorin plus Vein Ripper. And I mean, a lot of cases, Sorin plus Blood Ripper or Vein Ripper is just going to be a game over. But like in those big matchups, you kind of want to just, have your fast draw and, force your opponent to have very specific answers. But for like the rest of the format, you're just kind of like looking to short things up. Ashiok Dreamrender is going to kind of pull double duty against the other 2 best decks in the format, where you can kind of mill your opponent and then exile their graveyard. And you also have the static ability on Ashiok that says that spells or abilities your opponents control can't cause them to search their libraries. So for like the Amalia deck, you end up shutting off, some of the Artisan Fiends that I've seen some lists playing like 1 copy of those. You see them playing like the Fauna Shamans. They're not going to be able to search from those. They're not going to be able to put anything in with like Quarter Calling, which is very helpful, albeit even though it is probably like 6 to 8 cards in their deck, it is super helpful because a lot of the time they're looking to discard, their redundant creatures that they really don't care about to end up finding combo pieces or to find kind of like their little toolboxy creatures. And Ashiok is just going to absolutely tell them, no, that is not going to happen. You can play this on curve. You're on the play. They go turn 2 Fauna Shaman. You play an Ashiok. You end up milling them, getting rid of like their graveyard, and you potentially hit some of their other combo pieces. You get rid of anything that they could potentially get back with like a Return to the Ranks. And they basically wasted their turn playing a Fauna Shaman because it's just essentially going to be a 2/2 bear on the battlefield. I mean, I guess you could technically set up some potential things to get creatures back, but really, it's not really going to happen too much with like an Ashiok in play. Damping Sphere, we know that like Lotus Field combo is still a deck people that play, so Damping Sphere is very good in those matchups. Really, I won't say any matchups where you kind of get the feeling that your opponent is going to want to cast a ton of spells. You could absolutely bring this in against Phoenix, make it a little bit more difficult for them. Obviously, the games where they go, like turn 4, they play like 1 mana spell. 1 mana spell ends up costing 2, and then they're able to have enough cards in their graveyard to where they're able to like Treasure Cruise and end up delving to pay for the extra mana that Damping Sphere makes their spell cost. But it is a real cost because a lot of times they barely have enough cards to delve enough away and then bring back a Phoenix. So this could potentially just mean that if they want to do that, they end up having to eat one of their own Phoenixes to get back, maybe potentially having 3 in their graveyard, they have to eat 2 of them, so now they only get 1 back instead of 3, which, again, is like very good for that deck because then that's 2 birds you don't have to worry about, and you can very easily handle them and race them with stuff like Preacher of the Schism, Vein Ripper, Sorin Shenanigans, things like that. Blot Out, you have target opponent exiles a creature card or a planeswalker they control with the greatest mana value among creatures or planeswalkers they control. So this is like a way that you kind of get around Vein Ripper because you target your opponent and they end up getting rid of the Vein Ripper. There's nothing else in this deck that has a higher mana value than Vein Ripper, so you're able to just kind of get that out of there super easily. Liliana the Veil sort of kind of going to do the same thing, where if you play like take more of the control route as the kind of Rakdos Vampires deck, you can end up like killing some of the other creatures, and they're killing like Blood Tyler, Larvister, Legion Zealot, whatever, And then you can play Liliana of the Veil, force your opponent to sacrifice a creature. They end up sacrificing the Vein Ripper, and you just are miles ahead. You have Path of Peril for some of the other small like creature decks, like the Boros Convoke and stuff like that. And Leyline of the Void for like the graveyard decks. So that is the basic general idea of like the Rakdos Vampires list. A few things to note, that this deck does kind of play like a mid-range deck, but a lot of your hands can be just so aggressive that you kind of don't worry too much about trying to play a little bit of a control kind of strategy. In my opinion, like as playing Rakdos Vampires, I think if you have a 7 that doesn't have Sorin plus Vein Ripper, or even just like one of those two cards, you're essentially looking for a hand that kind of functions decently well. You're going to be looking for something like Preacher of the Schism, like Blood Tithe Harvester into Preacher, or maybe like into Shielder to the Apocalypse. Some of the, Fable the Mirrorbreaker stuff. You're just going to look for hands that are relatively aggressive, more so than controlling. I don't think this deck, necessarily plays very well kind of in the, like, I want to be the control deck route. Especially against like other decks that want to kind of be in that place as well. You get a lot of value from Vein Ripper, from your opponent wanting to play creatures. You get a lot of value from them, not really being able to pay, the ward cost for some of their targeted removal. So like having an early Vein Ripper, your opponent's either going to be a deck that has the creatures but doesn't really have the removal spells, or, has the removal spells but doesn't really have the creatures that they want to sacrifice to end up getting them back. And of course, like with Sorin, you kind of have like this built-in protection for Vein Ripper. So a lot of this deck kind of comes down to kind of like Sorin plus Vein Ripper. But of course, outside of that too, it is a very powerful deck. It is very consistent. You're going to have no problem at 25 lands finding and making your land drops, while also, with the help of Fable the Mirrorbreaker, kind of setting up some pretty crazy situations where you're going to have, multiple Vein Rippers a turn being able to attack, even if it's just one of them getting to attack, because it's still going to end up triggering and making your opponent lose a ton of life. If not, it's just going to hit your opponent, and they're going to end up being really sad, and the game is going to be over very quickly. You have, Bitter Triumph, Thoughtseize, Fatal Push. Like, use Thoughtseize is definitely, I would say, fairly aggressive. Again, like a lot of the time, you don't want to get a Vein Ripper in play, and you want to be able to protect it as much as possible. So, like, I would say that this is like more of a mid-range deck that cares a little bit more about taking the removal spells than it does, say, maybe potentially taking like your other opponent's creatures. Because again, you just want to protect Vein Rippers. You want them to play creatures, and you want to be able to kill them with stuff like Blood Tithe Harvester. You want to kill them with things like with the Bitter Triumphs and Fatal Pushes and things like that. Lastly, Fable the Mirrorbreaker plus Blood Tithe Harvester plus Vein Ripper is going to be a very, very nice for you, because you're going to be able to make a copy of Blood Tithe Harvester. It's going to make a blood token. You're going to sack it, give something -4/-4, more than likely be able to kill it, and then you're going to get a trigger off of Vein Ripper from the Blood Tithe Harvester dying, and then you're going to get another trigger from killing the creature. And this is going to be like another way that you can break up some board stalls and get in with like Preachers and get in with like Dusk Legion Zealot, off of like counters with Sorin, getting in with Shieldred, making sure that she's able to survive combat. Just remember that Blood Tithe Harvester you can only activate as a sorcery, because there's a lot of times where I think I've played with this card like in the beginning, and I think people even now that try to play Blood Tithe Harvester and they're just like, I'm going to be sneaky and I'm going to like block a creature and then sacrifice to target something else. Like, you're not going to be able to do that. You're only going to be able to activate as a sorcery. You can crack blood tokens, to end up getting cards and things like that. At instant speed, you can't activate Blood Tithe Harvester at instant speed. Also, final thing, again, we mentioned it kind of when we were going over the deck. Mutavault, when it's activated, is a vampire, so you're going to be able to get the benefits of something like a Sorin, where you're going to be able to throw it at your opponent, or you're going to be able to put counters on it, and then it's going to have Death Touch, Lifelink. It's going to end up being a 3/3, and it's going to retain those counters even after it's done being a creature, so you're going to have a land with like +1/+1 counters on it. It's going to look weird, but it's going to make Mutavault even better threat kind of like later in the game, because again, even if you don't plus on that anymore, you plus on like a Vein Ripper, plus on a Dutch Legion Zealot. A 3/3 getting to attack, essentially having a 1-mana 3/3 or a 2-mana 3/3, what have you, is still technically above rate, and is still going to enable you to do plenty of things like in the later turns, like casting another Fable the Mirrorbreaker, maybe playing a Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, what have you. So that is the Rakdos Vampires deck for the Pioneer format. Again, probably my pick for the absolute best deck in the format. and by far the most expensive deck that you can play in Pioneer at $915. And, you know, I think if you're looking to get into a deck that has the potential to kind of avoid bannings and things like that, then this is probably like one of the best decks to make that investment in. It's going to be a deck that's good for a while, unless there is some very specific like vampire hosers that get printed. You know, these mid-range decks have a very hard time, you know, being hated out of the format really by kind of like other people like playing. You know, like you want to try to go bigger, but a lot of what the other decks are good at doing, you know, is going underneath of those decks that try to go bigger. So Rakdos Vampires kind of, you know, finds a way to bridge the gap between being fast enough to the board to discourage some of the other faster decks in the format, but then also going a lot bigger than some of the other mid-range decks that could potentially keep up with its speed, that it just, you know, you have a hard time, you know, winning if you are on kind of like that big mana mid-range deck, or if you're on like something like an Is It Phoenix or like an Amalia combo and things like that. So that's the Rakdos Vampires list. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what deck you would like to see next. I kind of have a list of decks that I want to do, but I definitely would want some thoughts and opinions on what should come out next, what decks we should go over. Again, plan on doing this through the RCQ season and doing this with a lot of like the top decks in the format, maybe some other niche picks that I think could be some pretty powerful decks in the format as well. So if you want to see those videos, be sure to subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, all that fun stuff. You know, become a member today, you know, get shouted on the videos, things like that. Get access to some sweet perks, you know, we put out. And of course, as we kind of go on, we're going to end up getting more and more things added to that as well. So, you know, if you want to support me and my content further, you know, I would greatly appreciate it, of course. So yeah, that's going to do me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope to see you all in the next one.